Okay, so feel free to jump in with questions too throughout the slide, or sorry, throughout the presentation. But what is a resilience hub? So presumably you, like all of you folks, have at least heard the term. Otherwise, I feel like I would have gotten a lot of questions of what are you talking about? But briefly, a resilience hub is essentially a trusted community space. So it's not necessarily a site that we're going to build from the ground up, right? This is a location that exists within the community that is already kind of known as providing resources or providing support or being some kind of access point. Think of sites that, I'm sure you can imagine locations within your community that are currently providing services, and think about sites that might be providing, kind of a diversity of services. Those are likely good candidates for where hubs can exist. They're designed to serve everyday community needs. So these are very different than something like a disaster shelter or an emergency shelter that's, really only activated during specific times, disruption times, whether that be a natural disaster or some other kind of disruption. But these hubs essentially have three phases: an everyday phase, so they're providing day-to-day services; a disruption phase, so that might then mirror something more like a disaster emergency shelter, but probably will look a little different, and I'll talk more about that. And then a recovery phase. So then how is this location helping the community, the neighborhood, respond to that disruptive event? And when I use the word disruption or disruptive event, I think, I have some images. There's a tornado or a derecho for folks that, are from Eastern Iowa. So yes, they are natural disasters. They are collective disruptive events or collective shared disasters. And also really good hubs seek to address, smaller scale disasters. So think of on a neighborhood level or a household level. So really, the vision, the grand vision for these hubs is that it's meeting both the individual as well as the collective disruptive event. And as I already kind of said, they're designed to support residents before, during, and after those disruptive events. And so for a lot of the work that I've done with resilience hubs personally, I've often used the USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network framework. There is urban, obviously, in the acronym or the title of this organization, but I still think, I was using this model in Lynn County, which, does have some urban areas, but also has some rural areas. And so I do feel like a lot of the framework applies despite the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I do think it applies to not just urban areas too. And if you disagree, I'd love to have some conversation on that for folks that are interested, but probably after the webinar. So the framework highlights four kind of key areas. So things like community engagement. So again, where do we have locations within the community, within neighborhoods that already are doing a good job of engaging the community, of engaging residents? They're multifunctional. So this helps, make it a site that's not just, again, going to be used during one, acute event, but is something that is, a living, breathing, functioning place in the day-to-day. Equity and inclusivity is a huge component of the Resilient Hub model that USDN has provided. And so thinking about individuals, households that, might be either the most vulnerable to disruption events or have the hardest time recovering disruption events. So trying to design programming infrastructure to address some of the factors that might be specific to vulnerable populations. So think of people who speak English as a second language. Think of people who maybe have a physical disability. So again, keeping in mind not how we're just, kind of serving everyone, but also how we're being mindful of some of these barriers that might exist that can also become really heightened during disruptive events. And then, of course, sustainability and resilience. So that's probably for EECBG funds, the most obvious tie to leveraging those funds to help development. So things like, green power are often components of resilience hubs. Okay, so we talked about what resilience hubs are. What are they not? I feel like this can be really helpful, especially for folks that this might be a newer concept for, because what I've seen a lot is that, and this happens across like stakeholders, So I've heard EMA people, emergency management agency people say this. I've heard, kind of nonprofit leaders say this, but they're really not disaster shelters. They're not emergency shelters. So disaster shelters, think of like a Red Cross, right? That's something that there is a protocol that exists. My understanding for that process is that you have to, be a certified shelter. There's requirements for the number of individuals that can stay in that facility, which is dependent, of course, on space, as well as things like bathrooms. That's not what we're designing here. Not that there's not value in that, of course, but the hubs are not just made for disaster times. They're made for, again, these everyday functions that help build community and neighborhood resilience. Let's see. And they're not disconnected from community needs. So these aren't places that like you need some special, clearance or access or key card to get into. These resilience hubs are meant to be as accessible as possible. And when they're not accessible, thought, intention, and design should be put into figuring out how to increase access to these points. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Any questions so far? Okay. I want to do a check of understanding. So I know it's on the screen, but maybe elaborate. So we heard what resilience hubs are. We heard what they're not. Someone jump in and tell me what a resilience hub is. And I work with youth, so they are probably the hardest people to get to speak up, and I will wait as long as it takes.
It's a community serving space.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting to see how long we could drag that out, but I appreciate you not making it too long. Yeah,
it sounds like a British pub.
Okay.
Isn't that a community serving space?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, from that vantage point, that could be a good location, because often there is a pub within, a neighborhood. At least in Scotland, that was a pretty common structure. Oh no, Kenny left the meeting. Somebody check on Kenny to make sure he's driving okay. Oh, he's back. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think that was a bit of a joke, Steve, but yeah, there's a lot of structure within a pub, a neighborhood pub, right? Of a place that people know that they can go, that they're going to find, other individuals. So think about, we'll talk about infrastructure, but I don't think it's actually included on the slide deck. So it makes sense to say it explicitly. This could be a location that people are just going to for information, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be something that they're physically engaging with or some tangible product, but it could just be information. I would recommend, that a hub have other functions than just that. But again, for Lynn County and for my own personal work in this space, it was really motivated, catalyzed by the derecho event, and seeing both kind of how we had these like ad hoc, sites set up that just kind of in crisis mode sprung up, but weren't really organized, right? And then how that also competed with maybe structures that were organized, such as the Emergency Management Agency, right? And so really this work is trying to design a way where there's multiple points of resiliency, including what EMA might be doing and what the community is doing, but in a coordinated way. And so information for derecho, going back to that example, kind of landing the plane on the information piece, most people didn't have power for, up to over 3 weeks for some. And so for long stretches of time. So knowing where you can physically go, and especially in this day and age where so much is online, knowing where you can physically go for information or to connect with your neighbors, even just that is a huge help. So British pub would be great for that. Core functions of a
Sam,
resilience
did you
hub.
see Jolene's question in the chat?
No, I didn't. Thank you for monitoring.
Says, do these encompass food hubs?
Do these encompass food hubs? Can you say more about how you're using food hubs in that? You're thinking like HACAP or something like that kind of structure, or like a food bank, or both and? Cool example, Abby. Thanks for that. Well, I guess I'll respond to both since. So often the hubs that I've worked with, oftentimes there is a food security component, and that is largely because the locations are potentially already doing pieces of that, but they want to coordinate it or organize it in a more structured way. So for example, the Iowa City Bike Library, they would get people who would just drop off extra produce, right? Which is great to do, and like we don't want to stop doing that. But also, if we notice that a lot of their clientele are using, the food that's being dropped off, then part of the organizing and planning work for that can be, how do we make that something that is both consistent, and how do we then communicate that to the constituents or residents that we're serving? And part of what the hub planning work can be is really focusing in on the types of programming and services that they want to offer, right? So I wouldn't recommend that every hub do everything, but having kind of an ecosystem of these hubs within a county or smaller geographic area, so multiple neighborhoods have hubs that are designed for the needs of their neighbors, can be really beneficial. So food is definitely, that's okay, Julie. So food pieces of it are definitely incorporated into the hub. What that will look like will depend on the hub itself. For some hubs, they might want to, for example, provide land access to grow food. So that would look a little bit different than, getting like food boxes or having produce dropped off. Good questions. Okay. Key physical and operational features. So there's 5 foundational areas that you can see here: services and programs, communication, building and landscapes, power, and operations. And so what I want to kind of, highlight here from this slide is really that it's more than just the physical infrastructure. So this will be, I think, the opportunity within using EECBG funds is that they're not necessarily going to fund a hub from start to finish. So I'll walk through kind of 3 phases in later slides, but really EECBG funds are, can be used to support a piece of the hub's development, such as potentially power or building and land building. But some of these other pieces are going to also be key to figure out how a community, structures how these other pieces will be done, right? So for my exam, or for the work I've done, there's usually a planning process where you engage stakeholders and kind of identify, what we want to focus on for this particular hub. When you're using EECBG funds, it might take, you might start at a different place, right? You might start with the power, but just know that if you're using EECBG funds to do the power piece of the hub development, that there will be other pieces that you'll want to account for if you're using the USDN framework. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk about some examples. And I think I probably have like 10 more minutes. So most of this space will be for questions and discussion. I should have said at the top, but so just know, get your questions ready now. So real world examples. So some of you, this was a site at the REAMP conference tour. It was the Wellington Heights Community Church. And who went on that tour?
I did.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about what you saw when you were at the site.
Gorgeous murals.
They do have really good art, yeah. And maybe what part, so we talked kind of about what makes a hub. So maybe start to or provide some things that you notice at the site that you're like, oh, okay, I can see why this was a resilience hub?
Well, for one, it was already a gathering space for the neighborhood for a variety of reasons, so that made it a perfect location.
Yeah, because you probably noticed when you were in that, thanks, Carrie, you probably noticed when you were in that neighborhood that there were, obviously a lot of homes, right? Which makes sense for like choosing a hub that's in a neighborhood. And then there are also other non-homes, so commercial buildings or some other type of building, right? So there were options, I guess, that, that could have been selected to be that location, but this was selected. And you're right, it was in part because this is a physical spot, an organization that already has that community trust that people are already going to for a variety of different services, right? So it's a community church, but if you heard Keon speak, I'm sure he mentioned, having the fact that they don't just do, church service, right? There's programming throughout the week. There's tons of support to the neighbors living in that community. And also, this is a neighborhood that just regularly experiences or has experienced power outages. So outside of a disruption event, like the derecho, has challenges with accessing consistent power, right? So then that's part of what informed where we, like what we focused on for this hub development. Cool. So if you didn't, and probably not a lot of people got to get this angle, even if you went to the tour of the building. And so this is because of some of the reasons I mentioned related to their experience with accessing power, we really focused on energy here. So this is a great, this would likely be something that EECBG would be able to fund, right? So helping design the solar system that was actually put on this building. So you can see, this is a photo from Eagle Point, and you can see that huge solar array that was added to Wellington Heights Community Church. And what makes this even more impressive, in my opinion, is that it was done by 5 different partners. So this was the second resilience hub in Lynn County. And so we offered planning support and tying it into this larger objective of developing a resilience hub network in Lynn County, which was included in the sustainability plan. Eagle Point provided the solar panels. We had a partnership with Kirkwood. They used to have a solar program where students would be trained to install panels. I don't believe that program is running anymore to my knowledge, but I could be mistaken about that. But it provided an excellent, partnership, especially for this workforce development component, right? So bringing students, onto the site. It was a Saturday morning, and we had Eagle Point folks out there as well to kind of help with it, obviously with the install. But then, having the students, directly get their hands dirty, get their feet wet by installing these solar panels. And then also a partnership with Van Meter for some additional equipment, and then Our Future to cover remaining costs, so a local nonprofit. So, I think this really illustrates kind of, to me, this is what I would recommend for hub development, is having, at least a couple organizations that are going to help support the work, just because it helps legitimize it, it helps keep momentum, and it honestly helps people feel good. So after we were able to install that system, we had kind of like a neighborhood potluck. And so it was a sort of ribbon cutting where, each partner got to talk about the project, and then we invited neighbors, to see the project, to tour it. Obviously they can't get up on the roof, but we could look at the electrical panels, to have Stephanie and Keon talk about what it meant for the church, such as, lower utility bills, more consistent power. We added battery storage. So, it was, I really do think that this structure in terms of partner organizations in collaboration is a really good model and one I would recommend for communities that are considering working on hub development. And then neighborhood centers of Johnson County. So I've gotten the privilege of working on 2 hubs, helping develop 2 hubs in Lynn County. The city of Iowa City is a really excellent advocate and contributor, supporter of resilient hub development. I believe it's also in their sustainability plan, if I'm not mistaken. Sarah Gardner is pictured here, as well as Rachel Rockwell, who's the executive director of neighborhood centers for Johnson County. And I know we have some Johnson County folks on the call. So does anyone familiar with this organization?
Tamara, this is Brad Berenson. I'm with Johnson County. I have not been involved with it at this point. This is kind of my introduction.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, this is a great introduction, and I highly encourage you to reach out to Rachel and say you were on this webinar and you heard about their site and you want to know more. For folks that are not familiar with this organization, they do a lot of youth programming, and they have centers across the city. And so that's partly why we chose this location, because there was a lot of alignment in kind of the communities that they were already engaging and the neighborhoods that we wanted to also engage. And they were actually adding another site during this process. So that also, factored into the planning conversation of both what is actually built now, and then also some visioning work for what they were going to renovate. It integrated energy resilience. And so in this example, it actually became clear that for them, solar wasn't a good fit for their resources. And so we looked to other options for backup power. So it's not always, maybe a renewable energy source. I mean, I shouldn't put it in quotes. It's not always a renewable energy source that makes sense for the organization, but having, again, that kind of consistency and reliability and power, and trying to be flexible about how to gain that with the understanding or kind of the maybe forward vision of here's what we can do now, but we're, working towards something in the future. And their sites function year round. And so again, this is another example, I think, of kind of that model of not just having sites that are, have doors closed for most of the time, but again, are already known as trusted locations. And for this example, what also emerged as a priority for them, in addition to backup power, was a language line. So that's another example, again, of, something that you're maybe using in every day to help your clients, because their clients speak a bunch of different languages. But then in a disaster time, right, having that resource that staff already know how to engage, that residents know is available, is incredibly useful. And then the partner organizations here. So this was done I own a consulting business, Empowered Solutions Collective. So doing essentially the same work, similar work that I was doing for the hubs in Lynn County, but a little bit different, because I think this structure actually had about a 6-month planning window for the organization, which again, and I didn't put NCJC in, because they're the host, that's why I didn't do it. Don't mean to leave NCJC out, but obviously they're an important partner in this work. Anyway, they engaged in a 6-month planning process, which I would, if you have the capacity to support, I would highly recommend that, especially when you're working with multiple organizations, because it helps develop shared vocabulary and language, shared buy-in, shared understanding. So then it's not just, one organization kind of pulling others along, but it's something that is a collaborative effort. The city of Iowa City that provided planning and implementation funds. So they have a really amazing structure of supporting the planning work, but then also having about $100,000 for each organization that they supported, Bike Library and NCJC, $100,000 of implementation funding. So, I think obviously $100,000 is probably not going to cover everything that's in that plan, or the work that an organization wants to do to become established as a resilience hub. Depends on the organization and location, but it is a good start to, to have that obviously funding that you can then directly start to implement the plan. And then emergency management was also a huge partner. We had 2 folks from them that would participate in the planning sessions. And, I think, and was something at Lynn County that we obviously did as well, because what I noticed in those conversations, and this could be different for different EMAs, but at least between Lynn and Johnson County, it was this desire to not necessarily, to stunt these hubs, but to do it in a way where EMA was a partner, right? Was aware that these were being developed, what services they might provide, and what resources, might have to be diverted to this site versus EMA, right? Because EMA, I don't know how familiar folks are in this call with like how they work. I'm not an expert. But essentially, they're kind of the main point of accepting resources. And so if you have hubs that spring up, you don't necessarily want to divert resources to those hubs without, some coordinated effort and knowledge to this, kind of central hub. So it makes tons of sense, and including them in the planning process, whatever that will look like for your community, is an important part, and I would consider a best practice in the work. I said I was going to talk for 10 minutes tonight, so I'll try to get through the last couple of slides, but not too fast. Common types of resilience hubs. So municipal facilities can be really good. Things like libraries or community centers, potentially city halls or service buildings. I would say that in smaller communities, city halls or service buildings feel like they make more sense just because there probably are less buildings in smaller communities, right? So that's where people will likely, there's other resources being provided from those city hall or service buildings. So I would say in smaller communities, that's a good fit. I would kind of lean away from that a little bit though in larger communities like Cedar Rapids or Iowa City, just because there's a lot that they're already managing. But libraries, community centers, I think are some strong bets. Schools, K through 12 schools, obviously students are already going there. Oftentimes schools are in neighborhoods. That's shifting a little bit, but oftentimes there are schools in neighborhoods and parents are also going there. So that routine, that knowing of that location, and maybe your polling place is there, right? So there's all of these kinds of like social layering pieces that make that site a good known access point. Community colleges as well, they often have, thinking about Kirkwood, there's lots of land there, there's lots of other programming happening, and so those could be potentially good sites. Churches, career and technical centers, oh, sorry, I should have been back there, but churches are also a good site. I know that's probably where I've seen a lot of interest. That can depend on the church though, because sometimes churches have their own internal policies, which again can be worked through as long as there's that buy-in and support in developing those kinds of structures. Cultural centers and neighborhood nonprofits such as Wellington Heights or NCJC. So how can we use EECBG funds for resilience hubs? So hopefully it's a little clearer now, but essentially EECBG funds can help support some of the energy efficiency design upgrades for these locations, or solar or battery storage design, and other general planning and technical assistance. So I know that's like kind of vague, but also I think if this is something that your community wants to take further, kind of the next step is scheduling a meeting either with myself the next couple of weeks before I'm done with my fellowship, or Abby, to kind of figure out really specifically what we can support, what the grant can support. And I will say we've already had one of those conversations, and Abby has done a really good job of kind of narrowing it in for that community of what funds can support. Feel good about that. So scope energy and resilience upgrades, right? So assessing building conditions, looking at battery backup power, potentially solar arrays, helping to coordinate the technical assistance with those. There's some background. happening? Can't mute you though. Okay. Yeah, so planning and support to move projects from concept to implementation. So most of what Abby has been, kind of sharing throughout the grant just applied here, right? So there could be a little bit of, not leeway, but just because it's like a little bit of a new concept, I really feel like it makes sense to schedule that one-on-one call just so you can be really specific about the parts that you envision for your resilience hub. And I know Andy wanted me to make, I think I kind of said this, but just to like say it again, your process might be, approaching a location within your community that you think is a good physical site and saying, hey, what do you think about becoming a resilience hub, right? And so then in that scenario, you might really start by focusing on the power because that's what we have and you have funding to support right now, and that can help move the conversation along. And so, do what has momentum, right? And so that could be a good place to start the conversation because also that building will also obviously be improved from some of these potential upgrades. And knowing what that cost is then helps, have a specific tangible estimate on what these upgrades are going to cost, obviously, and what the cost of the overall development of the hub might be. And then, of course, EECBG will help ensure that projects align with the guidelines of the grant. So we're not asking you to do all of that, but that's again why those one-on-one calls will be helpful. So things like energy audits, solar feasibility studies have been funded, battery storage planning, and building system upgrades, as well as building an envelope improvement design. So I think that this has probably been said enough, but just to say it again on this call, especially since I'm being recorded, EECBG funds can support design work, right? Technical design work, not the implementation fund. So that will be something that you'll want to keep in mind as you're having those conversations or thinking about potential good sites or partner organizations. And we do have funding resource pages on the EECBG website. So it could be something where you're kind of looking through those funding pages and then maybe taking that as a fuller proposal to the potential applicant or organization. I feel like I've belabored this point a lot, so I won't spend too much, but essentially this is the part, these three phases, vision and feasibility, that kind of planning work I talked about. Not probably going to be covered by EECBG, but the design funding work will, and the implementation funding, no. So hopefully that helps like parse it out very clearly, or at least clearer. And so what's success look like? I always like to know, like, especially in sustainability work, like what is a reasonable, metric of success? In the short term for that organization or facility, it will likely mean lower energy costs. That was certainly the case with Wellington Heights Community Church, as well as that improved reliability, knowing that you have that battery storage if the power goes out, either from a countywide disaster or statewide disaster or a neighborhood disaster. And then stronger partnerships. I really feel like that's, what can separate a resilience hub from an emergency shelter. Other things too, but like the social resiliency component is interwoven throughout the resilience hub model. So those organizations, that process of doing together, those relationships don't just, like fizzle out after that work, especially if there's intention in keeping them going, right? And so I know that, for example, NCJC and EMA and public health are all talking to one another, thinking after, a year after we went through the planning process, they were organizing events because together, right, to preparedness events, because they knew each other, they knew who to call, they knew how to work together. And so it was really easy for them to then find other ways to continue those partnerships. Long term, of course, reduced energy burden, safer community spaces. If we have more points of resilience across their neighborhood and communities, and it puts less burden on organizations like EMA. Faster recovery after disruptions is also a result of that, and then increased trust and participation. So if you're interested in getting started, then think about a location within an existing community serving eligible space. So, and maybe you decide EECBG grants you still want to move this work forward without EECBG grants, that's cool too. Just know that those resources are available here, and those can help further conversations with potential applicants. And then begin, if you haven't already, discussing energy and resilience needs for that organization, ideally with their leadership, but honestly, whoever you can talk to, get your foot in the door. And then once you feel like you have, kind of those initial conversations underway or kind of done, reach out to Abby or myself. It's something where we're not expecting you to have like a full proposal, but at least like having interested parties and have like asked them if they're interested in the conversation goes a long way, which is kind of where we started with, one of the applicants that has reached out to us about using funds for resilience hubs. So that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. And if there are no questions, we can also just have a discussion. And then you can also run away if you are done with this. But I hope you stay.
Thanks, Tam. Could you give some information about size of grants or eligibility of the size categories of potential grants?
For EECBG or for the hub development as well?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. For resilience hubs, if there were to be applications through EECBG funds for that purpose.
Yeah, that's a good question. My understanding is that we're still at the 10,000 cap per building. Is that correct, Abby?
Yep, that's our current status, and will hopefully be updated this month to about 15K per building. And what that means is like per site address associated with the applicant.
Good question.
So, Tamara, do these locations actually have to be declared resiliency hubs and registered with the county or the city?
It's a fair question. So Iowa City has they are wanting to build a network. And so I would say for Iowa, if you're working in Iowa City, then it would make sense for you to obviously reach out to the Iowa City staff. Lynn County did not use any, we did not get to the point while I was there of having those kind of like markers or I don't know, I think of certifications at some level. USDN could have something since, the last couple of years, but I'm not aware of anything to that knowledge. So it is, I don't want to say it's like the Wild West, but it's an emerging field. And so, I think that is something that would make sense to have, but there's not a requirement to have that. Because even Iowa City's is just like their own certification because it's connected in partnership with their office. So it's not anything more elaborate than that. Good question. But that's also why I explicitly say, this is the USDN framework and the model that we use to develop them, because that then, even though there's not like it's not like LEAD where you have someone come in and go through the spreadsheet and check everything, right? But then it is based still in something that's like being replicated across the country as opposed to just like a county or a municipality.
Are there any deadlines coming up where we have to submit proposals by a certain timeline?
Deadlines for EECBG funds?
Yeah.
Nope, not like in the next, I think don't know how much of that is public, so I hesitate to say. But you have then definitely this entire year to submit things to ECBG, and I believe it will be longer.
Great. Good to know.
Good question.
Are grants written in such a way that for design and planning, that it's applying for funds to hire a consultant or someone to develop a plan, or is it a plan that can be done in-house through partner organizations?
Yes. No to the first one. I mean, okay, hold on. It's yes with an asterisk. So EECBG funds, to my knowledge, will not support planning work. So for that 6-month planning process that I helped lead with NCJC, that would not be supported by EECBG funds, is my understanding. And I would still suggest doing that. And so that could be done by hiring someone to do it external from the organization, or it could be done if if that organization has capacity, and they would require some that individual would obviously have to review a bunch of resources and become, so I don't want to it will be work for the organization. So if they have capacity, they could do that. But the benefit of doing it that way is that they obviously, know that organization probably better than an external consultant. And then they're also in the organization. So then for that implementation piece, it's not just you have someone who's in internal helping to move that along. So I think there's a ton of benefits of doing that way. It would probably just be more of a capacity thing, because there would be some education that would be helpful to the development of the hub. Good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too. We have had that question asked around can staff time be refunded through EECBG? And that's kind of what Tam's referring to, is that kind of extra staff time for involved parties cannot be reimbursed through EECBG. Just when you invite a technical assistance contracted person, we can service those types of funds.
Tamara, since it doesn't matter if a particular location in a community is designated as a resiliency hub, then typically we could do this for anybody that wanted to do it, just to improve their facility and how it's used in the community. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. From my understanding, I would say that that's accurate. Part of what we started working on at Lynn County was born from this Wellington Heights Community Church partnership, because then we had 2 hubs and it was now becoming this network. And so we're how do we not standardize it to the point where it makes it inaccessible, but make it something that people are more familiar with, right? Communicate about it. And then also, how do we provide pathways for other organizations that are interested in becoming hubs? And so we worked with the EMA department to actually kind of develop a process for that, which included, some of what they recommend for organizations, like the communication channel, for example, of how decisions will be made. And it was incredibly helpful. And we worked with the pilots were Prairie Woods, Teamsters Local 238, and I'm spacing on the last one, but we tried to pick organizations that both had different types of leadership structures and different physical sizes and different, Prairie Woods has a lot of land and grounds, right? And the Teamsters Hall has this massive open space. So I would think, that the more interest a community has, the more leverage or support there would be for having that kind of local structure. And that would go a long way to both supporting the hubs that already exist, as well as doing what you're describing, John, of help, getting more hubs online. Because essentially what we're attempting to do with these hubs is to, create multiple points of resiliency throughout the community, right? So then there's not one EMA that's trying to hit all of these different neighborhoods with their finite resources. So I think Yes, is the short answer, and I gave you a long answer too, John. Sorry.
It's fine. All good.
Out of curiosity, the Wellington Church, that looked like an old store building converted into a church. Is that accurate? Is that what it was or is?
Good question. So before it was a church, it was a community center. It was the Paul Engel Center. And they did a lot of arts programming. So I don't know what it was before that, but I agree. It does kind of have that design.
But accessibility is an important component of grants. Is that right?
For resilience hubs generally, for EECBG, not necessarily.
Okay.
Yes, Kenny.
I have a question on that Wellington Church. I know that solar was a part of that program. So knowing that, I'm assuming that it wasn't just a grid-tied solar system, that they had to have some sort of battery backup there to like help the community in a power outage, charge their phones and stuff. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And if you ever want to look at that, you know, I'm sure would be more than happy to open the closet, because that's where it is.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, because that we were just talking on our last big SETI call about that grant that's coming up real soon about portable energy and resiliency hubs in the community. And so looking at that, I think that that'd be a great avenue for churches to use to kind of expand their helping network.
Yeah. And okay. Kind of, I mean, so when I was at the county and kind of proposing that we invest more in EVs, I was framing that from more of not just like, you know, reduction in cost based off of, we had 2 EVs, and so we could see the cost of these vehicles compared to other sedans, and had data to support that they were cheaper, and both in like vehicle miles traveled as well as operation costs. But I was framing it as like a resilience feature as well, because what are electric vehicles but just mobile batteries, right? And so you could drive them, assuming not, you know, disruptive times, derecho, right? Not every place is open, but it's more portable than moving a building, right? So, yeah. And you know, that can be valuable for things like charging, or, you know, charging phones, keeping medicines refrigerated. So just to like, I don't know where, I'm just going to plant that seed in the space, because maybe that will be helpful for other folks on this call. But I really do still believe that that's a good, those portable and mobile resilience hubs, there's a lot of value, I think, in supporting that kind of model.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
So it sounds like people maybe have some ideas of locations in their community that at least it's worth a conversation. Is that kind of accurate?
I have one more question. Would you be able to share like any of the financials, like with the church or anything like that, just for other potential, say, churches that like, hey, I might be interested in that. What, you know, I understand that the technical assistance would cover, but what would a plan like that look like, or what did it look like in that case? Or
yeah, I can kind of track that down. I'm guessing it'll be really different for the cost, just because this. So know that they'll probably be a lot more expensive than what was actually paid for this one. But yeah, I can try and track that down.
Tamara, on March 21st, that's a Saturday, Iowa Faith and Climate Network is having a big get together. So there'll be a lot of churches represented there, and we'll be able to present at that. That'll be a good way to talk to all the churches about this potential opportunity.
Awesome. And I think you're obviously connected with the Universalists. What's the church that's not what they're called, but something like that.
Well, it was Iowa Faith and Power, and then they changed their name to Iowa
The
Faith.
Unitarian Universalist Church.
Yes, there's one in Cedar Rapids that put solar on their church. Are you familiar with that one, John?
I'm not.
Okay, that might be a good, let's talk offline, because that could be a good local model of like, look at this church did it and look at how much they're saving, or, you know, so.
Rob Hogue put it on his church.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
There's also
So
one in Iowa City, a Unitarian church in Iowa City, because we gave Best Development Awards to them.
Nice.
I'll just say that for more rural counties where emergency management kind of really leads the disaster response, I've found it really valuable to just go look at my county's emergency hazard mitigation plan. And they have different hazard mitigation plans for each community in the county. And you can kind of get a sense of what building, even if not an official emergency shelter, is kind of like their community hub for the building. Or if your county's doing the planning process for that hazard mitigation plan, I want to say it has to happen every 5 years or something like that.
Right.
It's a sweet process for an energy district person to get in on, and they're always looking for volunteers. At least they were in my county. They're like, ooh, someone wants to be here and they don't have to. Wow, great. So I just wanted to share that experience. It's been valuable for me to, meet new people and get touched into the resilient side of our county in case anyone else likes that idea.
Yep, great suggestions. The hazard mitigation plans were what we use to kind of think about, you know, the more physical design of the hubs, but definitely came into play in the process. So thank you, Kristen, for flagging that. And yeah, I mean, we were having conversations with, trying to think of it wasn't Kagan, but I can't remember the municipality now, but you know, it was a community that had one road that was their main street, right? And like we were having conversations with them at their city hall because they wanted to have these kinds of sites. And Ely at the library, they do an excellent job of providing food access. Thanks, Kristen. And so, you know, that made sense for Ely for their library to explore. So it really, I would say, like where there's energy and momentum and there's the ability to have longer term like support, and longer term here being 5-10 years, just to outlive, it makes it really hard when like there's lots of transitions in the partners, right? So finding those kind of stable partners, or partners that you think are going to be more stable. So like libraries often have like a separate board, right? And so that can provide that kind of stability of like, hey, we're buying into this for at least 5 years. And, you know, if it doesn't work for a community, it's okay that they pivot, but you do want to give it some time to assess and evaluate. So thinking about those leadership structures can also be a little helpful.